Hi, my name is Helena, and I'm going to tell you something that happened to me a few weeks ago. Something that completely changed the way I see my own reflection. You know that feeling that something is wrong, but you can't quite put your finger on what it is? Well, this story begins like that. I've always been a person of routines. Wake up at 6:30 a.m., breakfast always the same, work from 8 a.m. to 5 p.m., gym 3 times a week. And I also had a routine that you might find strange. I always wake up in the middle of the night to go to the bathroom. I don't know if it's anxiety, if I drink too much water before sleeping, but this happens religiously between 2 and 3 a.m. every single day. I live alone in an old apartment downtown. You know those buildings from the 70s? Wooden floors that creak, thick walls, high ceilings. It's the kind of place that seems to have history in the walls. My grandmother always said that old places keep memories, and I never gave much credit to that. But being honest, I always had a somewhat strange feeling in this apartment. Nothing specific, you know. Just a feeling that I wasn't completely alone. When I moved here 3 years ago, I thought it was just a matter of adaptation. The apartment had an incredible price for the location, and that should have been a warning sign. The realtor seemed too eager to close the deal, vaguely mentioning that the last tenant had moved out suddenly. But I was desperate to leave my parents' house, so I ignored all the signs. The first months were normal, or at least I thought they were. But there were small things that started bothering me. Objects that I was sure I had left in one place would appear in another. The apartment always seemed colder than normal, even with the heater on. And there was that bathroom mirror. That old mirror with a worn golden frame that came with the apartment. I tried to replace it several times. I bought new modern mirrors, but always ended up postponing the installation. There was something about the old mirror that hypnotized me, even while making me feel uncomfortable. It was as if it were an essential part of the apartment, something that couldn't be removed without consequences. But adult life is like that, right? We kind of ignore these things and move on with life. Work, bills to pay, relationships. Who has time to think about strange mirrors? On that Tuesday, August 15th, I woke up as always at 2:47 a.m. I remember the time because I looked at the red digital alarm clock on the nightstand and thought, what irritating punctuality. I was exhausted. It had been an especially busy day at work. My boss had overloaded me with 3 different projects, and I had stayed late trying to organize everything for the next day. I put my feet on the cold floor and immediately felt a chill run up my spine. The apartment was colder than normal. Or maybe I was more sensitive. I grabbed the robe that I always left at the foot of the bed, but even so, I felt the cold penetrating through the thin fabric. I walked through the dark hallway. I knew every floorboard, every creak they made under my bare feet. First board, a small moan. Second, a dry crack. Third, silence. It was a familiar symphony that accompanied me every night for 3 years. But that night, as I headed to the bathroom, something was different. It wasn't the cold. It wasn't the silence. It was as if the very air was denser, heavier, as if someone had subtly changed the atmosphere of my own home. The hallway seemed longer than normal, the shadows deeper. I stopped at the bathroom door and hesitated. For a few seconds I stood there, with my hand on the cold golden doorknob, feeling a strange resistance to entering. It was ridiculous, I knew. It was my bathroom, in my house. I had used that bathroom hundreds of times, maybe thousands. I knew every tile, every stain on the wall, every defect in the grout. But there was something in the air, an energy I had never felt before. It was as if the apartment itself was breathing, pulsing with its own life. I shook my head, laughing at myself. Helena, you're sleepy. Stop with this paranoia, I thought. I turned the doorknob and pushed the door. What I felt the moment I entered the bathroom was as if I had crossed an invisible barrier between 2 worlds. The cold hit my face like a solid wall of ice, and my arms instantly got goosebumps, every hair standing up in a primitive alarm reaction. It wasn't just the temperature. It was as if the very air had a different texture, denser, almost palpable, as if it could be cut with a knife. I felt a strange pressure in my ears, like when you're on a plane about to take off. That uncomfortable feeling that something needs to pop to equalize. But there was no altitude change there. It was my own bathroom, on the second floor of an old building, the same place where I brushed my teeth every morning. I turned on the light, and the bathroom was illuminated with that familiar yellowish light from the old bulb that I always said I was going to replace, but never did. The light flickered once before stabilizing, casting shadows that seemed to move on their own through the corners of the room. Everything seemed normal. The white sink with small rust stains in the corners, the glass shower that I religiously cleaned every Sunday, the blue towels hanging in their usual place, my toothbrush in its habitual position, the nearly empty liquid soap dispenser that I had forgotten to refill. But the feeling of discomfort didn't pass. It was as if I was being observed, studied, analyzed by invisible eyes that knew every movement of mine. But there was no one there. Obviously. How could there be? I lived alone, on the second floor, and had locked all the doors before sleeping, as I always did. I tried to calm myself, breathing deeply the cold, heavy air. It's just tiredness, Helena. You need to sleep better. Maybe it's time to see a doctor, do some tests. I started doing what I had come to do, but my eyes kept wandering, almost against my will, to the large mirror above the sink. It was an old mirror, with a golden frame worn by time, that came with the apartment. The gold had lost its shine in several places, creating an irregular pattern of dark spots. I had never liked it much. I always thought it made me look paler than I really was, more tired, more ghostly. It was when I looked directly at the mirror that I saw, or at least I thought I saw. Behind my reflection, right in the upper right corner, there was a shadow that shouldn't have been there. A shadow that moved independently, with its own purpose. It wasn't just a distortion of light or a stain on the wall. It was something that had form, substance, presence. My heart raced, beating so hard that I could feel the pulse in my temples. I turned around quickly, the movement so abrupt that I almost lost my balance. Nothing. Absolutely nothing. Just the white wall with the chrome toilet paper holder and a small moisture stain that I always said I was going to paint over. I breathed deeply once more, trying to control my accelerated heart rate, and looked back at the mirror. My reflection stared back at me, pale and visibly scared. Wide eyes, gasping breath, an expression of barely disguised terror. There was no shadow now, just my frightened face returning my gaze. How ridiculous, I murmured to myself, but my own voice sounded strange in the environment, as if the words got stuck in the cold, heavy air, echoing abnormally. It was as if the bathroom had different acoustics, as if the walls absorbed and distorted sounds. I washed my hands quickly, wanting to get out of there as soon as possible. The water from the faucet was colder than normal, almost freezing, and the soap kept slipping between my trembling fingers. But while I rubbed my hands, trying to create foam with soap that seemed unwilling to foam, I felt something again. A presence. It wasn't imagination this time. It was a physical, real, tangible sensation. It was as if someone was standing right behind me, so close that I could feel the heat, or rather the cold emanating from their presence. It was like having someone breathing on my neck, that feeling that makes all the hair on your arms stand up at once, like an electric wave running through your skin. I froze, with my hands still under the faucet, the cold water running between my paralyzed fingers. Slowly, as if I were moving through molasses, I raised my eyes to the mirror, afraid of what I might see reflected there. It was there again, the shadow, but this time it was sharper, more defined, more present. It seemed to have the clear shape of a person, tall and thin, with contours that suggested long hair floating around the face. She was standing exactly behind me, occupying the space I knew was empty. My reflection remained normal, but that dark form was there, motionless like a statue, as if observing me with infinite patience. I could almost feel the weight of her gaze, even though I couldn't see her eyes. I swallowed hard, the sound echoing strangely in the bathroom silence, and without taking my eyes off the mirror, I turned slowly, each movement deliberate and controlled by fear. Nothing. Once again, absolutely nothing. My heart was beating so hard that I could hear it echoing in the silent bathroom, like a distant drum announcing something terrible that was to come. I closed the faucet with trembling hands, the cold metal burning my sweaty skin, and turned toward the door. I needed to get out of there, now, before something worse happened. I reached for the door handle, anxious to return to my room, get under the covers and forget that strange moment. Maybe even call my mother in the morning, make up an excuse to spend a few days at her house. Anything to get out of that apartment, at least for a while. But when I tried to turn the handle, nothing happened. The cold metal remained motionless in my hand, as if it were welded in position. I tried again, this time with more force, pushing and pulling, turning to both sides. Nothing. The door was completely locked, as if it had never been made to open. "This can't be happening," I whispered, feeling panic begin to rise up my throat like acid bile. My breathing was getting shallow, too fast. I knocked on the door, first gently, as if it were just a misunderstanding that could be resolved with delicacy. "Come on, come on!" I spoke louder, my voice coming out more shrill than I intended, but my own voice sounded muffled and distant, as if the bathroom had somehow swallowed the sound, absorbed its sound waves before they could reach my own ears. I tried the handle once more, turning it with all the strength I had, the muscles in my forearm contracting with effort, but it remained motionless, as if it were a solid part of the door. The cold metal burned my sweaty palm, leaving a numb sensation that traveled up my arm. The panic was intensifying now, a claustrophobic feeling wrapping around me like an invisible straitjacket. I began pounding on the door with closed fists, each knock echoing strangely in the environment. It was as if the sound came back to me multiplied, distorted, creating a disturbing echo that seemed to come from several directions at once. "Please," I whispered, leaning my forehead against the cold wood of the door. "Please, open." That's when I noticed something was happening with the mirror behind me. Even with my back to it, I could feel a change in the bathroom atmosphere, as if the temperature had dropped even more a few degrees. The air was getting so cold that I could see my own breath forming small vapor clouds in front of my face. There was a different light reflecting on the white door in front of me. A bluish light, weak and pulsing, as if it were generated by something electrical that was malfunctioning. But there was nothing electrical in the bathroom besides the yellowish ceiling light, and it remained on, stable. I turned slowly, each movement a battle against the fear that paralyzed me. What I saw made me choke on my own air. The mirror was fogged up, covered by a dense mist as if someone had taken the hottest shower in the history of humanity. But I knew this was impossible. The shower was dry, there was no steam in the air, and the bathroom temperature was freezing. But the most disturbing thing was that the vapor didn't distribute randomly across the mirror surface. It formed strange patterns, deliberate contours, as if guided by invisible intelligence. There were forms that seemed intentional, drawings that suggested figures. And through the mist on the glass, I could see a silhouette forming with growing clarity. It was no longer just an undefined shadow like before. It was clearly the shape of a woman, tall and thin, with long hair that seemed to float around her face as if she were submerged in water. She was standing on the other side of the mirror, not behind it like before, but literally on the other side, as if the glass were a window to another place, another world. And most terrifying of all, she was looking directly at me. I could feel the weight of her gaze, even through the mist that covered the mirror. It was a gaze that knew, that studied me, that knew things about me that I myself had forgotten. I tried to scream, opened my mouth and forced air out of my contracted lungs, but no sound came out. It was as if my voice had been physically stolen, ripped from my throat by invisible hands. I tried again, desperate, concentrating all my energy on producing some sound, any sound, but only a hoarse and pathetic whisper escaped. The silence in the bathroom was absolute now, heavy and oppressive like a wet blanket. Even the knocks I had given on the door seemed to have lost any echo, as if the sound had been sucked into an impossible acoustic void. The figure in the mirror began to move. Slowly, as if moving through a viscous liquid. She raised a pale hand and placed it against the glass, from the inside. I could see the palm print forming on the fogged surface, 5 long and slender fingers pressing against the mirror, as if it were a flexible membrane that could be crossed with the right pressure. I backed up until I hit the door, my body trembling uncontrollably, every muscle contracted by pure terror. I wanted to close my eyes, wanted this to be just a horrible nightmare from which I could wake up, but I couldn't look away. It was as if I were hypnotized, trapped in the gaze of that thing that watched me from the other side of the mirror. The woman in the mirror tilted her head to the side, studying me like a scientist observes an interesting specimen, and her lips curved into a slow and disturbing smile. It wasn't a gentle or comforting smile. It was the smile of someone who knew a terrible secret, something I hadn't discovered yet, but would soon discover. It was then that I realized the most terrifying thing of all. She wasn't just in the mirror. The glass was beginning to undulate, like the surface of a lake disturbed by a stone. She was approaching the surface, as if the mirror were just a thin membrane she could cross whenever she wanted. And by her smile, I knew that moment was coming. I knew I had no choice. The door remained locked. My voice had disappeared as if it had never existed, and the only way out seemed to be confronting whatever was happening in that cursed mirror. With slow and deliberate steps, fighting against every instinct that screamed for me to run, I approached the sink, keeping my eyes fixed on the figure that watched me from the other side of the undulating glass. Each step I took seemed to echo eternally in the supernatural silence of the bathroom. The cold floor burned the soles of my bare feet, but I barely felt the physical pain. All my attention was focused on the woman in the mirror, who remained motionless, waiting for my approach with the patience of someone who has all eternity. The closer I got, the clearer she became, as if my proximity increased her definition, her reality. I could see her features now with disturbing clarity. A middle-aged woman, maybe 40-something, with an angular and aristocratic face. But there was something wrong with her proportions. Her eyes were too large, deeply dark, like bottomless wells, and seemed to absorb light instead of reflecting it. Her long black hair undulated constantly as if it were underwater, each strand moving independently in a hypnotic dance that defied any physical logic. She wore something that seemed to be a white dress, but as I approached, I could see that the fabric was stained and torn, as if it had spent years, or decades, deteriorating. There was something terrible, and at the same time familiar about her features. It was like looking at someone I had known for a long time, but couldn't locate in memory. A feeling of déjà vu so intense that it made me feel nauseous. I stopped a few centimeters from the mirror, so close that I could feel my own breath bouncing off the cold surface. My own reflection was there, pale and terrified, but she was right behind, occupying exactly the same space that should be just empty air. It was physically impossible, a violation of the basic laws of reality, but it was happening right in front of me. Our eyes met through the glass, and I felt a wave of recognition so strong it almost knocked me down. It wasn't just that she looked familiar. It was something deeper, more intimate. It was as if I were looking at a distorted version of myself, a Helena who had taken a very different path. "Who are you?" I tried to ask, but no sound came from my contracted throat. She seemed to understand anyway, because her smile widened, revealing teeth that were too perfect, too white, as if made of fine porcelain. There was something deeply wrong with that smile, something that made my stomach churn. Slowly, as if hypnotized, I raised my own hand until it almost touched the mirror surface. I could feel a strange energy emanating from the glass, like a low-voltage electric current that made my skin tingle and the hair on my arms stand up. It was a sensation that went beyond the physical, as if the very structure of reality was unstable at that point. The woman mirrored my movement with disturbing precision, placing her pale palm exactly opposite mine, with only the glass separating us. It was as if we were performing some kind of ritual, a ceremony whose meaning I didn't understand, but that seemed to have consequences extending far beyond that moment. The instant our hands aligned, separated only by the thin barrier of glass, I felt a wave of intense and supernatural cold rise up my arm like liquid mercury. It was like touching dry ice, a coldness that burned and numbed at the same time, penetrating through skin, through muscles, straight to the bones. But I couldn't pull my hand away. It was as if it were magnetically stuck to the mirror surface, trapped by a force that went far beyond physical will. I felt my muscles contracting, trying to pull my arm back, but it remained motionless, glued to the glass by an invisible attraction. That's when she spoke. I didn't hear her voice with my ears. It was as if the words appeared directly in my mind, completely bypassing the auditory system and installing themselves in my brain like thoughts that weren't mine. I knew you would come back. The words echoed in my consciousness with crystalline clarity, loaded with an absolute certainty that made me tremble. My eyes widened, and I felt my heart skip a beat before accelerating to an impossible rhythm. Come back? I had never been here before. Or had I? The word come back implied a history, a past, experiences I should remember. But that remained covered by a thick fog in my memory. Images began flashing in my mind like old photographs being flipped through quickly. Fragments of memories that didn't seem mine, but carried a disturbing familiarity. Me, standing in this same bathroom, but younger, maybe 5 years younger. Me, looking at this same mirror, but wearing clothes I didn't remember buying. Me, having the same impossible conversation, but with words I couldn't recall. The woman in the mirror nodded slowly, as if she could see every image passing through my mind, as if she were the author of those fragmented memories. You always come back, she said in my head, her mental voice loaded with ancient sadness and infinite patience. Every night. Every time you think it's the first time. The mirror began to glow with a more intense bluish light, as if powered by energy coming from another place, another plane of existence. The surface undulated like liquid water, distorting our reflections hypnotically. The woman's hand began pressing through the glass, which deformed like an elastic membrane, yielding to her supernatural pressure. I tried to step back, use all my strength to break the magnetic connection that held me to the mirror, but my own hand was fused to the surface now, as if it were an integral part of the glass. I could feel its coldness spreading up my arm, heading toward my shoulder, as if I were slowly being absorbed by the mirror. No, I managed to whisper, finally recovering a thread of my voice, though it came out as a hoarse and desperate whisper. This isn't real. She laughed, a sound that echoed both in the physical bathroom and inside my head, creating a disturbing harmony between the real world and whatever that place was where she came from. Real? Her mental voice carried a note of cruel amusement. Dear Helena, what is real? Do you think you're awake? Do you think you're alive? The words hit me like physical punches, each one loaded with implications that my rational mind refused to process. Alive? What did she mean by that? Of course I was alive. I was there, standing, breathing, feeling the cold, feeling fear running through my veins like liquid adrenaline. Look around, she whispered, her voice now loaded with strange urgency. Look really. See what has always been there. I obeyed, even against all my instincts, even knowing that what I was about to see would change everything forever. I took my eyes off the mirror for the first time since I had seen her clearly, forcing myself to look around the bathroom I thought I knew so well. And what I saw made me understand that there was something deeply, irrevocably wrong with my entire reality. The bathroom was no longer the same. The changes were subtle at first, but as my vision adjusted, they became screaming, impossible to ignore. The walls, which I was sure were white and clean, now had a grayish and sickly color. The paint wasn't just peeling, it was rotting, literally decomposing on the walls like dead skin, revealing a structure underneath that seemed old, damp, and infected by decades of neglect. The shower box that I religiously cleaned every Sunday was cracked, with fissures spreading across the glass surface like a giant spider web. Glass fragments were scattered across the tile floor, some so small they sparkled like macabre diamonds under the yellowish light that now flickered irregularly. The blue towels I had bought last year were now dirty and torn rags, hanging on rusted supports that looked like they hadn't been touched for decades. The fabric was stained with substances I preferred not to identify, and emanated a smell of mold and decomposition that made my stomach turn. With my heart racing and breathing becoming increasingly shallow, I moved away from the mirror, or tried to move away. My hand was still stuck to the surface, but I managed to stretch my arm enough to reach the door handle. To my surprise, it turned easily now, as if the previous resistance had been just a test, a preparation for this moment. I pushed the door with desperate force and ran into the hallway, dragging my stuck arm and feeling a sharp pain in my shoulder. But what I found on the other side of the door made me stop abruptly, as if I had collided with an invisible wall. The hallway had also changed, transformed into something from my worst nightmares. The walls I knew by heart, where I had hung pictures and photographs, were peeling and dirty, covered by moisture stains that formed disturbing patterns, almost like faces screaming in silence. The wooden floor that used to creak familiarly was now rotten in several places, with missing boards revealing a dark and deep void underneath, as if the very structure of the building was being devoured by something invisible. The air smelled of decomposition and abandonment, a sweet and nauseating odor that stuck in my throat. The ceiling light flickered frantically, casting dancing shadows that moved independently of the objects that created them. These shadows seemed to have their own life, contorting and stretching through the hallway corners like dark tentacles searching for something, or someone. I ran to the living room, desperate to find something familiar, something that made sense, something that would anchor me to the reality I knew. But the living room was an even worse nightmare than the hallway. The furniture I had chosen so carefully, saving for months to buy each piece, was broken and covered by thick spider webs like dirty cotton. The beige sofa I had bought on sale was torn in several places, with stuffing coming out like open wounds bleeding yellowish foam. The pillows I always arranged carefully were thrown on the floor, stained by dark substances that formed repulsive patterns. The windows that faced the street were covered by boards of rotten wood, nailed irregularly, blocking any external light that might enter. The air in the room was stagnant, stale, loaded with dust and something more, something organic decomposing. "What's happening?" I screamed into the void, and this time my voice echoed through the apartment, but sounded distorted, as if coming from very far away or being filtered through layers of water. The words ricocheted off the damp walls and came back to me transformed, almost unrecognizable. I tried to turn on the lights, frantically searching for the switches I knew by heart were beside the door. But when I reached where they had always been, I found only smooth, damp wall. The switches weren't where they should be. In fact, they weren't anywhere. The walls were completely different, with irregular holes and cracks I had never seen before, as if the apartment itself had aged decades in a matter of minutes. It was like being in a deteriorated, abandoned, and haunted version of my home, a version that had been forgotten by time and left to rot. That's when I began to hear the whispers. First, they were just indistinct murmurs coming from the walls, as if there were people talking on the other side, in a language I could almost understand, but not completely. Gradually, the sounds became clearer, more insistent, closer. They were several voices, all whispering my name with different intonations, different ages, different eras. Some sounded like lost children calling for their mother, others like tired elderly people sighing a last goodbye. But all repeated the same thing: Helena, Helena, Helena. The voices came from everywhere simultaneously, from the cracked ceiling, from the moldy walls, from the rotten floor. Some were high-pitched and desperate like children's, others deep and profound like old men who had smoked their whole lives. There were female voices that whispered my name like a prayer, and male voices that shouted it like an accusation. But all repeated my name with growing insistence that made me want to cover my ears and scream until I lost consciousness. It was as if each voice were a lost soul that knew some secret about me, something I had forgotten or chosen to ignore. I ran to the window, desperate to see the street, to be sure that the outside world still existed, that there was still normalcy somewhere. My hands trembled violently as I tried to tear off one of the wooden boards blocking the window. The wood was damp and soft, rotting under my fingers like old fruit. When I finally managed to create a small opening and looked through it, what I saw made me stagger backward, my legs trembling so much I could barely stand. There was no street. There were no other buildings. There were no parked cars, no streetlights, no life. There was only darkness. An absolute and dense darkness, like black ink that seemed to have physical substance, as if it could be touched, molded, breathed. It was as if the apartment were the only thing that existed in the universe, an island of deteriorated reality, floating in an ocean of absolute nothing. The sight was so disturbing, so fundamentally wrong, that my brain refused to process it completely. No, 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 I repeated like a mantra, pounding my fists against the boards until my hands began to bleed. This can't be real. This can't be happening. The voices intensified, responding to my agitation as if they fed on my fear and despair. Now they were no longer whispers. They were screams, laments, pleas. The entire apartment seemed to pulse like a giant, sick heart, the walls expanding and contracting rhythmically, as if it were breathing. The furniture began moving on its own, dragging across the floor with horrible sounds of wood breaking and metal scraping against the rotten floor. The coffee table I used for magazines began sliding in circles. The kitchen chairs marched in single file like ghost soldiers. It was as if all the apartment objects had gained their own malevolent life. I covered my ears with my bloody hands and closed my eyes, trying to block out that impossible reality. It's a nightmare, I whispered to myself, repeating the words like a protective spell. It's just a nightmare, and I'm going to wake up. I'm going to wake up in my bed, in my normal apartment, and all this will have been just a bad dream. But when I opened my eyes, I was still there. The voices continued, now singing my name in a haunted melody that seemed to come from a choir of lost souls. The sound echoed through the rotten walls and came back multiplied, creating a cacophony that made my head throb. There was nowhere left to run. Every corner of the apartment had transformed into rotted versions of themselves. There was no escape through the windows. There was no outside world, except the bathroom, the mirror. The woman who knew things about me that I myself had forgotten. With weak legs and an irregularly beating heart, I returned to the bathroom. When I entered the bathroom again, it had returned to normal. The walls were white and clean again. The towels were hanging in their usual places. Everything exactly as I remembered leaving it before all that madness began. For a moment, I felt such immense relief that I almost fainted. Maybe all of that had been just an extreme hallucination. Maybe I was having some kind of nervous breakdown caused by work stress. But then I looked at the mirror, and she was still there. The woman watched me with that disturbing smile that seemed to know all my secrets. And now she seemed even more real than before. More solid, more present. It was as if she had gained substance and definition while I lost mine. As if we were trading places on some invisible cosmic scale. "You came back," she said. And this time, I heard her voice clearly in the bathroom, not just in my head. It was a hoarse and low voice, as if it hadn't been used for a long time, as if it had been stored in some dusty place for decades. There was a note of cruel satisfaction in her tone, as if my return confirmed something she had known for a long time. I approached the mirror slowly, each step deliberate and heavy. There was something fundamentally different now. My reflection was there, but it seemed faded, as if I were losing color, losing definition, losing the very substance that made me real. It was like watching an old photograph that was slowly fading, the contours becoming less defined with each second. Meanwhile, the woman behind my reflection became increasingly vivid, more detailed, more present. I could see every wrinkle on her face, every strand of hair that undulated around her shoulders, every stain on the white dress she wore. It was as if we were trading places on some fundamental level of reality. "Who are you?" I managed to ask, my voice coming out weaker than intended, as if my very vocal cords were losing substance. "I am you," she replied, and her smile widened, revealing those teeth that were too perfect. Or rather, I am who you were, and you are who I'm going to be. The words didn't make sense in my rational mind, but something deep inside me, some primitive instinct, understood perfectly what she meant. A horrible sensation began growing in my chest, like a poisonous flower slowly blooming. "What are you talking about?" I asked. But even asking the question, part of me was already beginning to understand, even though my conscious mind refused to accept the truth. She moved even closer to the mirror surface, until her face was inches from the glass. I could see her eyes now with disturbing clarity. They were eyes that had already seen too much, suffered too much, waited too much. "Do you think you're alive, Helena? Do you think you're really here, at this moment, on this night?" "Of course I'm alive!" I screamed. But even as the words left my mouth, I began to doubt. Fragments of strange memories continued appearing in my head, like pieces of a puzzle I didn't want to assemble. Me in this bathroom, but at different times, with different clothes, but always the same scene, always the same conversation, always the same ending. "When was the last time you really remembered how you got home today?" she asked, her voice now soft, almost maternal, like a mother explaining something difficult to a child. "Do you remember leaving work, getting stuck in traffic, going up the stairs, having dinner, getting ready for bed?" I tried to remember, forcing my mind to retrace through the hours that preceded this moment. But the memories were vague, nebulous, like failed attempts to remember a dream that was escaping. It was like trying to grab smoke with my hands. I remembered waking up to go to the bathroom, but before that, there was only thick fog, a void where there should be concrete memories. "That doesn't mean anything," I insisted, but my own voice sounded weak and without conviction, even to myself. Doubts were spreading through my mind like ink on absorbent paper, staining every thought with uncertainty. The woman laughed, a sound that echoed through the mirror and filled the bathroom with impossible harmonics. "You died a long time ago, Helena. In this same bathroom. You slipped on the wet floor, hit your head on the corner of the sink, and died alone, bleeding on the cold floor. And since then, you repeat this same night, over and over endlessly, like a scratched record that plays the same song eternally. But every time you forget, every time, you think it's the first." Her words hit me like an avalanche of ice, each syllable loaded with a truth I had spent so much time trying to avoid. Images began flashing in my mind with growing and disturbing clarity, memories I had buried so deeply that I didn't even know they existed. Me, getting out of the shower on a rainy night. How long ago? Months? Years? The wet and slippery floor. My bare feet losing grip. The sensation of falling, of losing control, of inevitability. The horrible sound of my skull colliding with the sharp edge of the marble sink. The metallic taste of blood in my mouth. "No," I whispered. But the memories kept coming like a flood that breaks a dam. Me, trying to scream for help, but not being able to produce any sound because my throat was full of blood. Me, feeling my strength draining as warm blood flowed across the cold bathroom floor, forming a crimson pool around my head. The loneliness. The terrible loneliness of dying completely alone, with no one to hold my hand, no one to tell me everything would be okay. Just the silence of the empty apartment and darkness closing around me like a cocoon. "And I," continued the woman, her voice now full of strange and disturbing compassion, "I am who you became after, trapped here in this eternal loop, repeating the same night indefinitely, waiting for someone who could free me. But now it's your turn to take on this burden." She extended her hand through the mirror, and this time the glass offered no resistance at all. It was as if it were made of water, undulating and deforming as her hand passed through it. Her cold fingers touched my face, and I felt a coldness that penetrated to the core of my soul, if I still had one. "No!" I screamed, trying to back away, but discovered I couldn't move. My feet were stuck to the floor as if they were part of the floor itself. It was as if I were becoming part of the bathroom, part of the apartment's physical structure. "You're already here with me," she whispered, and her hand passed through my face as if I were made of mist, of thoughts, of memories that were dissolving. You always were. The life you think you had after your death. The apartment you think you're inhabiting. All of this is just echoes, reflections of a reality that no longer exists. That's when I finally understood the complete truth, and it hit me with the force of a runaway train. I looked down and saw that I could see the bathroom floor through my own body. My hands were translucent, as if made of frosted glass, and becoming more transparent with each passing second. I wasn't solid. I wasn't really there. I wasn't alive. How long had I been dead? Months? Years? Decades? Time had no meaning when you're trapped in an eternal loop, repeating the same sequence of events ad infinitum, like a ghost condemned to reenact its own tragedy for all eternity. You're starting to remember, said the woman, now completely emerging from the mirror with fluid and graceful movements. She was solid, real, alive, while I became increasingly ethereal, more ghostly. With each repetition, you become a little less real. And I become a little more. That's how it works. That's how it's always worked. The truth was more horrible than any nightmare. I had died in that bathroom, and since then I was trapped in a distorted version of reality, reliving infinitely the moments that preceded my death. The deteriorated apartment I had seen was the real one. Abandoned, forgotten, rotting for years since my body had been discovered and removed. I tried to run, but my feet passed through the floor as if it were made of air. I tried to scream, but my voice was just a distant whisper, an echo of something that had once been real. I was disappearing, dissolving like salt in water, losing the last bit of substance that kept me anchored to any form of existence. "This is your home now," she continued, walking around me as I floated, unable to control my own body that was no longer mine. "You'll repeat this night forever, or until someone new comes to live in this apartment, someone who can take your place in this cycle. You'll try to understand what happened, try to escape, try to find a way out, but you'll never succeed, because there's no way out, because you can't escape what you are, a ghost, trapped in a time loop." The reality around me began to distort and change. The bathroom walls began moving, approaching me like the walls of a cube that was closing. Or maybe I was being pulled into them, absorbed by the apartment's very structure. I felt an irresistible force dragging me toward the mirror, like an invisible whirlpool that sucked my essence into the glass. It was like being pulled into a black hole, except this black hole was made of reflections and memories and eternal regrets. "No, please," I pleaded, but my voice was already just a distant echo, a whisper that could barely be heard even by myself. "I don't want to be trapped here. I don't want to repeat this forever." The woman smiled with terrible kindness and positioned herself exactly where I had been moments before. She looked at herself in the mirror with an expression of deep relief, and for the first time, I saw her reflection appear on the surface with perfect clarity. A solid, real, living reflection. She had achieved what she wanted, a way to escape the eternal prison. "Thank you, Helena," she said, and her voice now sounded exactly like my own voice when I was alive. "Thank you for giving me a chance to live again. Now it's my turn to have a real life, even if it's only until the next lost soul finds its way to this mirror." I felt the glass sucking me like a cosmic vacuum, pulling every fragment of my soul into its reflective surface. I tried to resist, grab onto anything, but there was nothing solid to hold. I had no more strength, no more substance, no more choice. I thought I was leaving. I whispered the last words I could form before being completely absorbed by the mirror, sucked into the glass like water being absorbed by a sponge. I thought I was escaping, that I was going back to my normal life, but I never escaped. I was already inside the mirror all along. And then, everything went silent. The transformation was complete. I was on the other side now, trapped inside the mirror, looking through the glass surface at the bathroom that I once thought was mine. The woman, who now had my face, my body, my stolen identity, smiled at me one last time before leaving the bathroom, closing the door behind her with a sound that echoed like a tombstone being closed. Now I'm the one who waits, trapped in the mirrored dimension, watching the real world through a glass barrier that I can never permanently cross, waiting for the next lost soul who will wake up in the middle of the night, who will enter this haunted bathroom, who will look at this cursed mirror and see my silhouette forming behind their own reflection. Because the cycle never ends. It never can end. It's an eternal prison built of reflections and memories, and the desperate need to escape, even if it's just by trading places with another equally condemned soul. And if you're hearing this story, if you live alone in an old apartment, if you have the habit of waking up in the middle of the night to go to the bathroom, be careful with mirrors, especially the old ones, those with worn golden frames and surfaces that seem to absorb light instead of reflecting it. Because maybe, just maybe, someone like me is waiting on the other side, waiting for decades or maybe centuries for a chance to trade places with you, waiting to steal your life, your identity, your reality, while you remain trapped forever in the world of reflections, waiting to trade places with you, forever. And who knows, maybe you're already looking at one of those mirrors right now while listening to this story. Maybe you've already seen a shadow moving behind your reflection. Maybe you've already felt that inexplicable chill that runs up your spine when you're alone in the bathroom in the middle of the night. If so, don't look back, just don't look.